I took care of my grandson so they could move abroad in peace. A year later, my daughter-in-law returned baby in her arms, only to hand me an eviction notice from the very home I built with my life. But I stayed silent because I knew she wasn't just kicking me out. She was hiding something far darker. If you think this is just another family drama, you're wrong. Subscribe now to catch more emotional, twist-filled Reddit stories from us. Lucille Harper didn't wake to an alarm clock anymore. At 71, it was the birds that woke her, those cheeky blue jays pecking near the rosemary shrubs, and the morning light slipping like silk through the gauze curtains of the sunroom. She sat at the kitchen table, stirring a single spoon of sugar into her coffee, her joints aching slightly as they always did after a cold night. The air smelled of periwinkle and old paint. The kettle on the stove whistled faintly from where she'd boiled it 20 minutes ago and forgotten. She didn't mind. There wasn't much to remember these days. The house was quiet, too quiet for a place that used to thrum with life. Every creak in the wood flooring had a name once: Gregory running barefoot down the stairs, Emma humming in the kitchen, a dog that used to scratch the front door before every rain. But now the old Harper estate in the hills of Northern California was filled with shadows that didn't speak and furniture that hadn't been moved in months. She sat across from the fireplace and stared as she did every morning at the photograph above the mantel. A black and white snapshot captured 26 years ago, framed in a carved oak border, the same border her late husband had whittled by hand when Gregory turned 10. It showed all three of them standing beneath the apple tree in the backyard, Gregory with his 2 front teeth missing Emma's hair caught mid-breeze, and Lucille wearing a yellow apron stained with peach preserves. Time never dared to touch that picture. Lucille's fingers, a little knotted, now brushed the side of the frame as she walked by. The warmth from the fireplace didn't reach her skin the way it used to. Still, she paused there every morning just long enough to let the silence stretch. The memory of that day lived inside her like an ember bright enough to warm, not strong enough to burn. It had been 18 months since Gregory and his new wife left for Brussels. Emma. The first Emma Gregory's college sweetheart was a kind girl with quiet eyes and steady patience. She had died 5 years ago. Ovarian cancer. Lucille had held her hand at the end. That winter, Gregory fell apart. Then a year later, he remarried. To a woman Lucille barely knew and never quite understood, Savannah. They had moved to Europe for Gregory's work, something about engineering contracts with a Belgian firm. Just temporary, Ma, he'd said with that smile that tried to hide guilt. A few months while Savannah adjusts after the baby. Lucille had nodded and kissed his forehead at the airport. "You take care of that little one," she'd whispered, her voice catching. It was her first grandchild. The thought that she wouldn't be there to hold him, to watch his first laugh or lull him to sleep, hurt in ways she didn't put into words. But she didn't protest. Lucille never protested when people left. She just wrote letters. Every week since then, she'd written to her grandson. He didn't have a name yet when they left, so she started each letter with "My little shooting star." Gregory never mentioned if the letters arrived, but still she wrote. The latest letter sat on the table in front of her, sealed with a tiny blue sticker of a rabbit on the back. "My little shooting star. Today." The roses in the garden finally bloomed. They're just as stubborn as your father used to be, holding tight through the frost until they're ready to show off. You'll be that way too. I think quiet but unshakable. I hope your parents tell you stories. I hope they read to you before bed like I did with your dad. There's a picture of him on the fireplace. You're in it too, in a way. You just haven't arrived yet. She never signed "Love, Grandma." It felt presumptuous when you'd never met. Lucille slipped the letter into a wooden tray near the door where all the others had gone. 56 letters. Never mailed. She didn't have the address. Savannah never gave it. She stood up slowly, her knees stiff. Outside, the garden glowed with morning dew. The fence needed repainting, and the tomato plants were late to sprout this season. She stepped into her boots and made her way to the flower beds with a small trowel and a basket. Working with soil kept her mind clean. Birdsong filled the air as she pulled weeds. Her fingers worked without thought the way an old piano player can still play hymns from memory. The house watched her from behind its wide windows, old and regal, with a quiet melancholy. It was a beautiful house, wrap-around porch ivy curling up the eaves' hardwood floors, and a library with stained glass windows. But now it felt like a museum of laughter long past. At noon she came back inside, washed her hands in the sink, and made herself a sandwich. The silence sat with her at lunch. She didn't mind. She'd learned to make friends with silence. After lunch, she sat in the sunroom and flipped through an old leather-bound photo album. Gregory's baby pictures. His first drawing. Emma on their wedding day. Her own husband's smile, blunt and confident, always with a hand on Gregory's shoulder. She hadn't opened this album in months, but today it called to her. As she turned the pages, her eyes caught on a familiar photo. A younger Lucille holding baby Gregory in a blue blanket by the lake near Yosemite. She remembered that day not because of anything grand, but because it had rained just as they were leaving, and she and Tyson had laughed like children running back to the car, soaked to the bone. She lingered on the image, her fingers tracing the outline of the lake in the background. That cabin had been their favorite spot. A tiny retreat, nothing fancy but full of memories. Gregory had learned to swim there. She closed the album gently, then looked up at the fireplace again. The photograph in the oak frame hadn't changed, but Lucille had. Her hair was more silver now. Her eyes carried more silence. Her hands trembled sometimes when she tried to slice apples. The wind stirred outside, brushing against the glass panes with a soft whistle. She rose and walked to the fireplace again. This time she reached up and gently took the frame off its hook. She brought it to the kitchen table and sat down with it, holding it like one would a fragile keepsake. The frame creaked faintly in her grasp. The wood was dry, brittle, but the image inside, Gregory's toothless grin, Emma's soft smile, Lucille's proud eyes, was still vivid. Lucille set the frame down and lit a candle beside it. Then she wrote another letter. My little shooting star. Today, I looked at the photo of your father when he was your age. You have his eyes. I know I haven't met you yet, but I believe that when I do, we'll speak the same language, the language of books and gardens, and things that matter more than money or distance. She paused, the pen hovering. I hope your mother reads this to you one day. But if she doesn't, I hope you find it for yourself when you're old enough to wonder. She signed this one. Love your Grandma Lucille. She folded it, sealed it, and placed it atop the others in the wooden tray. Then she walked back to the fireplace and rehung the oak frame with slow, reverent care. Outside, a wind had picked up, shaking the branches in the backyard. The old swing set creaked once, then stilled. Lucille stood before the fire, her arms crossed loosely, as if holding something that wasn't there anymore. Come home soon, she whispered into the room, not to anyone in particular, but to the memory that still lingered in the corners of the house. The room didn't answer, but the fire crackled once softly like it understood. The knock on the door came just after 9 on a Tuesday morning. Lucille wasn't expecting anyone. She stood in the kitchen holding a sponge mid-wipe over the counter, listening. 3 firm knocks. Not the mailman, not the neighbor, and not the wind, not this time. She dried her hands, slowly walked to the front hall and opened the door. There she was, Savannah. Her son's wife stood on the porch like a storm behind polished sunglasses, hair slicked back into a sleek chignon, a baby carrier strapped to her chest, a suitcase behind her, and a rental car idling at the curb. Lucille, she said coolly, as if she hadn't vanished overseas a year ago, without so much as a holiday card. Lucille's eyes dropped to the infant swaddled in a gray blanket, face flushed and asleep. Her breath caught. She'd seen photos, just 2, both sent months ago, but this was different. The baby was here, real, breathing. Savannah, Lucille murmured, voice barely above a whisper. What? What are you doing here? I need a place to stay. Just for a bit, Savannah replied, stepping forward like she didn't need permission. Gregory's tied up with work. We thought I could handle things from here. Lucille stepped aside out of habit more than consent. The air shifted the moment Savannah crossed the threshold, like something cold had entered the house. Savannah unstrapped the baby with precision and laid him gently in the bassinet she pulled from the suitcase. Then she turned her smile practiced. "I know this is sudden, but I thought it would be good for the baby, and for you." Lucille folded her hands together, gaze still fixed on the sleeping child. He was smaller than she'd imagined. Pale cheeks, soft lashes, a tuft of downy hair at the crown of his head. "What's his name?" she asked softly. "Dawson," Savannah said, setting a bottle on the mantel like it belonged there. Gregory liked the name. Lucille nodded, though no one had consulted her. No one had even told her the birth had happened until days later via a short email. She didn't let the bitterness rise, not yet. "I thought you were staying in Belgium for another year," Lucille said carefully. Savannah shrugged. Plans changed. The place was too cramped, the air too damp. Besides, it's better to raise Dawson here. And there's something else. Lucille waited. "I need to make some income," Savannah said matter-of-factly. "And Gregory agreed we could list the house temporarily, just until things stabilize. We'd stay in the guest suite. I'll manage the rental process." Lucille blinked. "List the house. Just short-term," Savannah added quickly. "Luxury clients. Film crew, maybe? I already have a few prospects." Lucille's heart slowed. "Gregory said that. He supports me. That's what matters, isn't it?" She didn't answer. She wanted to ask 1,000 questions. Why now? Why here? Why didn't you call first? But she was too stunned to form them. The child stirred his mouth, twitching in sleep. Lucille's instincts silenced everything else. She leaned down, brushing a fingertip across his tiny hand. So warm, so impossibly fragile. Savannah watched. "Would you mind preparing the guest suite? I didn't sleep much on the flight." Lucille looked up, startled. "Of course," she said quietly. By nightfall, the baby had claimed the master bedroom. Savannah had taken the east guest room, Lucille's old sewing room. Lucille herself had quietly moved her things to the attic. She didn't complain, not aloud. The days that followed fell into a strange rhythm. Lucille cooked meals, folded laundry, restocked the fridge. Savannah took phone calls on the back porch and stayed up late, tapping away at her laptop. Dawson cried often, colicky and restless, and Lucille was always the one to rise in the night. She didn't mind. The baby was the only joy in the house. It was Thursday when Lucille first noticed the printer. She had walked past the dining room on her way to the laundry and heard it whirring quietly, a stack of crisp pages spooling out onto the floor. It wasn't hers. Lucille hadn't used the printer since Gregory graduated college. The old Canon had been replaced apparently by a sleek white machine Savannah had brought with her. Lucille peeked into the room. No one was there. Just the printer humming quietly in dozens of pages with unfamiliar markings. She stooped to glance at one, then quickly stepped back. It wasn't English. The text was in Dutch. Or maybe Flemish. She couldn't be sure. But what caught her eye wasn't the language, it was the format. It looked like a tax document, a bank certificate, and then another, a rental contract with names she didn't recognize. She didn't touch the papers, just watched them printing one after another, neat and precise. That night, after Savannah had gone out for air and the baby had finally fallen asleep, Lucille returned to the dining room and gathered 3 loose pages from the printer tray. She didn't read them right away. Her hands were shaking too badly. She waited until she was upstairs, door-locked, curtains drawn. Her reading glasses perched on her nose, she flipped through the papers. One appeared to be a financial statement from a bank in Switzerland. The second, a W-2 form with an American name and social security number, and an income total of $900,000. The third was what stopped her cold. It was a U.S. tax return for someone named Maria L. Simmons, age 42, claiming 5 dependents and a tax refund of $34,000, except the signature line was blank, and the font was slightly off like it had been copied from somewhere. Lucille folded the papers, slid them into a manila envelope, and tucked it into the back of her closet behind a stack of Christmas linens. Her sleep that night was shallow. The baby cried at 2 a.m. Lucille went to soothe him, whispering lullabies from a time long gone. In the morning, Savannah was already seated at the table, laptop, open, coffee steaming. She looked up when Lucille entered. "Did Dawson give you trouble?" she asked casually. "Not at all," Lucille replied. "He's an angel. Savannah smirked. "Enjoy it while it lasts." Later that day, Lucille vacuumed the living room. Beneath the ottoman, she found a piece of paper half crumpled, likely dropped accidentally. She picked it up. A photocopy of a passport. Not Savannah's, not Gregory's. The name read Niels Vandenbroek. Lucille's stomach dropped. Attached to it was another form partial torn on one side, a social security application with the same face, different name. She stood there, the vacuum humming behind her, the paper trembling in her fingers. It wasn't just income fraud. It wasn't just odd paperwork. This was identity fabrication. Lucille turned off the vacuum and stared at the baby monitor on the kitchen counter. Dawson stirred in his crib. Innocent, oblivious. The house suddenly felt foreign, as if Savannah had brought something with her from overseas, not just suitcases, not just baby bottles, but something that slithered beneath the surface. Hidden, illegal. Lucille folded the paper, slipped it into her apron pocket, and looked around. Something was wrong, and she was standing in the middle of it, alone, but not afraid. Not yet. Lucille didn't remember exactly when she stopped trusting Savannah. Maybe it was the night she heard the back door click shut at 2:17 a.m., followed by the low murmur of voices outside that stopped the moment her bedroom light flicked on. Maybe it was earlier when Savannah began locking drawers she had no reason to lock. Or perhaps it was when Lucille, reaching for a stack of laundry on the hall table, found a manila folder still warm from the printer that bore an IRS seal but smelled faintly of fresh glue. Whatever the moment, she felt it now like a blade under the skin, and so quietly Lucille began to prepare. It started with an old Nikon digital camera she found in the attic, wrapped in a wool scarf, inside a forgotten box labeled Thanksgiving 2011. The battery was dead, of course, but she found the charger in a drawer beneath Gregory's old track medals. It took 2 days to power up. The lens was dusty, the buttons a little sticky, but it worked. She hid it beneath a stack of recipe books on the bottom shelf of the hallway cabinet. The first photo she took was of a document left on the dining room table briefly unattended while Savannah took a phone call on the patio. Lucille crept in barefoot like a thief in her own home. She didn't understand the legal terms, but she recognized the layout false income statements, forged pay stubs, multiple names. Snap, click, one by one. She took photos in silence, her heart racing. Later, she uploaded them to an old laptop of Gregory's she found in the guest closet. She disconnected it from the Wi-Fi and saved everything on a USB drive shaped like a tiny violin. Each night, she waited until Savannah was asleep. Then she crept through the house, checking doors, examining drawers, counting documents. She didn't take anything, just photos, just enough. One morning, she heard Savannah on the phone in the kitchen. "I'll meet him Tuesday, same place. Make sure he brings the originals. I'm not paying until I see everything." Lucille stood just outside the archway, hidden by the curve of the wall, heart hammering. Savannah's voice dropped. "No, it's safe. She's harmless." There was silence, then laughter. That laughter stayed with Lucille longer than the words. It was sharp, glinting like glass soaked in contempt. "She's harmless." That afternoon, Lucille followed Savannah. It wasn't difficult. Savannah announced she was taking Dawson for a stroll downtown. She left the baby with Lucille. "Just for an hour, I swear," and backed out of the driveway in her rented Mercedes with the windows cracked and a designer tote tossed in the back seat. Lucille waited 15 minutes before taking the truck. She kept a safe distance. Her hands were steady on the wheel. Savannah parked in front of Cafe Verona, a sleek glass cafe nestled between a boutique pet salon and an overpriced florist. She stepped out in heels, sunglasses, blazer draped over her shoulders. She looked like a diplomat's mistress. Lucille watched from across the street. She had parked beside a shuttered bookstore and tilted her rearview mirror just enough to catch the reflection. At exactly 3:14 p.m., a man approached Savannah's table. Tall, blonde, early 40s, clean-shaven pinstripe suit, European by the look of him. He didn't sit. He handed her something, an envelope, and she slid a black folder across the table in return. They didn't speak for long. Lucille snapped 4 photos through the passenger window. Savannah smiled as she slipped the envelope into her tote and kissed the man lightly on the cheek before walking away. Lucille ducked down. Later, back at the house, Lucille examined the photos. They were grainy but clear enough. The man's face, The exchange, the folder. She zoomed in on one image where Savannah's hand rested on the envelope just before placing it into her bag. A small stamp was visible on the corner one Lucille had seen before. Bank of Luxembourg. That night, Lucille couldn't sleep. Dawson cried at 2 a.m. again. She held him in the dark, rocking gently, the tiny weight of him cradled in her arms. His breath was shallow, rhythmic, his body warm against her chest. "You don't know what's happening around you," she whispered, pressing her cheek to his forehead. "And that's the only mercy here." The next morning, Savannah was in the kitchen early, typing furiously on her laptop, one leg folded under her coffee gone cold beside her. Lucille paused on the stairs, pretending to dust the railing. "Did you and Dawson have a nice walk yesterday?" she asked lightly. Savannah didn't look up. "Oh, yeah, we just wandered. The baby needed fresh air." Lucille smiled faintly, nodding. "Of course." Later that week, Lucille went looking for the iron in the linen closet and discovered something else. The closet was smaller than she remembered. She pressed her hand to the back panel and felt the resistance, then the give. A hidden latch. It clicked softly. When she pressed again, a section of the panel swung open like a miniature door. Inside was a narrow staircase leading up steeper than she recalled from her childhood. The attic. She hadn't been up there in years. Gregory always hated that space, said it smelled like mothballs and ghosts. Lucille climbed the steps carefully, each creak beneath her feet a warning. At the top was a narrow corridor ending in a locked door. A bolt had been installed, new industrial, not part of the house's original design. She reached out and tried the handle. Locked. She tried the bolt. Locked. Savannah had changed the locks. Lucille's breath caught in her throat. She bent down, peering through the keyhole. Nothing but darkness. But she could hear it, the faint buzz of electricity. Not lights, machines, printers, scanners, a humming router. She stood up and backed away slowly, one hand on the wall for balance. Back downstairs, she sat at the kitchen table, her tea untouched. Something was happening in her home, something calculated, hidden, dangerous. And she was the only one who knew. She thought about calling Gregory, thought about sending him the photos, the recordings, the copies of Savannah's documents she now kept in a locked metal box beneath her bed. But what would he say? Would he believe her? He'd already chosen Savannah over her once. When she'd voiced her concerns after their rushed marriage, he'd waved them off. "You don't know her," he'd said. "You don't understand her world." Lucille hadn't wanted to understand that world, but now it had arrived at her doorstep. She looked toward the fireplace. The photograph in its carved oak frame stared back. Gregory's toothless grin, Emma's laughter, her own arm around them both. Everything had been so simple once. Lucille rose, crossed the room, and stood before the mantel. The fire had burned out hours ago, but the coals were still warm. She reached up and touched the frame. "No," she whispered. Her voice was steady, quiet, but final. "This isn't going to continue." She stood there for a long time, the silence of the house wrapped around her like a shroud. She wasn't harmless. Not anymore. The last time Lucille Harper saw Walter Briggs, they were sitting on the tailgate of a rusted truck, sharing lukewarm lemonade and watching dusk settle over the foothills behind his cabin. That was 15, maybe 20 years ago, back when Walter still wore a badge, and Lucille still believed she'd never need to ask anyone for help again. She hadn't intended to call him. Not really. His number had been penciled into the margins of an old church directory buried in her nightstand between expired coupons and forgotten reading glasses. She only found it because she'd been searching for her will, some part of her needing to remember that she still had control over something. When she finally pressed the numbers into her cell phone, her thumb hovered over the green button for almost 2 minutes. Then she exhaled and tapped it. "Yeah," a voice answered after 2 rings. Gruff, wary, unmistakably Walter. "Walter," she said, her voice unsure for the first time in weeks. "It's Lucille." A pause, a breath, then warmth. "Lucille Harper." Hell, I haven't heard that voice in a lifetime. "I need to see you." The silence on the line thickened. "Is this about Gregory?" "No," she said, then hesitated. Not directly. She told him nothing over the phone. He didn't ask. Just gave her the same address he'd lived at for decades, a 1-lane road by Lake Oriole, the cabin tucked beneath redwoods, hidden from view. She made the drive the next morning. The roads were familiar. The same winding paths they'd taken on church picnics and charity deliveries, back when Lucille used to cook Sunday meals for the widowers in town. She'd met Walter at one of those lunches, back when he was still a detective, still wore his pain like a uniform. His cabin hadn't changed, still unpainted, still lopsided at the roof, still charming in a way that didn't try to be. Lucille knocked twice. The door opened slowly. Walter Briggs stood there in a flannel shirt and denim jeans, silver hair tucked beneath a worn ball cap. He was older, but not weaker. His frame still carried the same quiet authority that once filled interrogation rooms. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," he said. "I come bearing baked goods," Lucille replied, lifting the paper bag. "Then you can come in." They sat at the small kitchen table, same scratches in the wood, same faded tablecloth. Lucille passed him a scone. He passed her a cup of coffee. They didn't speak for several minutes. Finally, Walter leaned back. "So, talk." Lucille reached into her purse and pulled out the USB drive. She placed it on the table between them like a live wire. "I think Savannah's involved in something," she said. "Something big." Walter didn't move. "Savannah, Gregory's wife." Lucille nodded. "And Gregory, abroad. Still thinks she walks on water." Walter picked up the USB and turned it between his fingers. "What is it?" "Photographs, documents, scans, passports, tax forms with names that don't belong to any real person I know, and a locked attic filled with equipment I'm not allowed to see." Walter exhaled through his nose. "Jesus, she's printing false identities." Lucille continued, her voice steady. "And moving money. I don't know where or how far it goes, but I think she's laundering, or worse." Walter stared at the drive, then at her. "And why come to me?" Lucille smiled faintly. "Because 20 years ago, I stopped you from drinking yourself into a grave after your son overdosed. Because I told the bishop you needed time and not shame. Because I came every week for 6 months with dinner and stories when everyone else left you alone." Walter's mouth tightened. "You kept the world turning." Lucille leaned forward. "Now I need your help to stop mine from falling apart." Walter didn't speak for a long while. He fetched an old laptop from a drawer and plugged the drive in. The files loaded slowly. He clicked through images, photographs of Savannah shaking hands with a man outside Cafe Verona, close-ups of passport copies, fake IRS documents, a string of emails in broken Dutch screen grabbed from a browser Lucille had managed to open when Savannah left her laptop unattended for 6 minutes. He paused on one image. "This symbol," he murmured. He zoomed in on a stamp in the corner of a scanned contract. "I've seen this before." He disappeared into the back room and returned with a manila folder yellowed by age. Inside were clippings, reports, notes. One paper had the same symbol, 3 concentric circles around a stylized phoenix. Lucille raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" "A watermark. From a Dutch ring we investigated before I retired. They created ghost identities, sold them to whoever needed a second life, embezzlers, fugitives, even mid-level politicians. The case went cold when 2 of their operatives vanished in Prague." He tapped the screen. "And now your daughter-in-law is printing their forms in your dining room." Lucille folded her hands. "I need to know what to do. I don't want Savannah hurting my son or dragging this house into a federal investigation." Walter closed the laptop. "Do you want the police involved?" "I want justice, and I want it done right." Walter studied her. "You willing to get your hands dirty?" Lucille looked him dead in the eye. "They've been dirty since the day I gave birth." A grin crept to the corner of Walter's mouth. "Well then, Lucille Harper," he said, "let's write a sting." He grabbed a legal pad and started sketching a timeline. "We need to bait her. Make her feel secure. Give her just enough rope. If she's sending out documents or negotiating rentals as a front, we build a scenario she can't resist. One where she thinks she's in control." Lucille nodded slowly. "She's obsessed with control." Walter drew a circle on the pad. "The house. That's her base. We'll use it." "We pretend I'm moving out," Lucille said. "Downsizing. She thinks she wins." Walter's eyes lit up. "And we stage a potential buyer. Wealthy, foreign, desperate to close quickly and quietly." He jotted down more notes. "I've got an old contact in Vice. He'll lend me a clean badge and an alias. We'll record everything. Every handshake, every document exchanged, every lie." Lucille's breath caught. "And when do we act?" Walter looked up. When she's most confident, when she believes no one's watching. Lucille picked up her cup. Her hands no longer trembled. Then let's give her a show worth watching. The old house on the hill wasn't just a battleground anymore. It was bait. Lucille stood in the center of her bedroom, staring at the 3 cardboard boxes she'd stacked carefully beside the bed. Inside them were sweaters, a few photo albums, her late husband's shaving kit, and the music box Gregory had given her for Christmas when he was 12. The rest she left behind. Clothes, books, furniture, relics of a life that Savannah had already begun to hollow out. She left the bedroom door open on purpose. She wanted Savannah to see the boxes, wanted her to feel that tug of false victory. By late afternoon, Savannah was floating. Lucille watched her from the edge of the staircase just beyond the kitchen arch. Savannah was on the phone, her voice laced with glee. Yes, she's finally moving out. Took longer than I thought. She clings to that place like a ghost. A pause, laughter. Well, she doesn't suspect a thing. She's old, not stupid, but she wants peace. She's not going to fight. Lucille didn't flinch. She turned and walked quietly back upstairs. That night, Savannah didn't come home until well past 10. She smelled like perfume and white wine, her heels clicking across the hardwood with victorious precision. Lucille sat at the kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea, flipping through a gardening catalog. Savannah raised an eyebrow, still awake. Lucille smiled without looking up. Just thinking about peonies. Savannah didn't reply. She walked past her keys, jingling like a warning bell. The next morning, Lucille received a knock at the front door. A man in a black turtleneck and Italian loafers stood on the porch. He was tall, sharp-featured, with the smug smile of someone who'd never had to lift a box in his life. Lucille answered cautiously. Yes, I'm looking for Ms. Voss, he said. Savannah Voss. She's inside, Lucille said, stepping back. Savannah appeared a moment later, dressed in a silk blouse and black slacks, looking like a corporate heiress. You're early, Dimitri, she said, kissing both his cheeks. Come in. Lucille stepped aside, watching them closely. Dimitri's eyes scanned the house, the corners of the ceilings, the molding, the framed paintings, like he was appraising more than just real estate. Lucille stood at the edge of the hallway, half-shadowed. Savannah waved a set of documents. We'll be in the study, Lucille. This won't take long. Lucille nodded, then walked quietly back to the stairwell. As she reached the first step, she paused. Savannah's voice had lowered, but not enough. Lucille stayed still. Here's the proposal. The house is already off-grid in terms of tax structure, Savannah said. She's voluntarily moving out. All we need is to keep it under her name for 6 more weeks, then I'll arrange the international transfer. Lucille gripped the handrail. Her pulse slowed, sharpened. The shipment arrives Thursday, Dimitri said. We'll have everything out by nightfall. My team is discreet. Savannah's response was a whisper, but Lucille caught the words. Good. Once it's done, I'm leaving. First class to Lisbon, then south. The conversation blurred in Lucille's ears. She turned slowly, her mind locking the phrase in place, I'm leaving. After everything, after the betrayal, the manipulation, Savannah intended to vanish. With her son's name, with her grandson, with the house, with everything. That night, Lucille didn't sleep. She sat in her dimly lit room, the curtains drawn. The window cracked slightly to let in the cool night air. In her lap lay the worn oak picture frame, the one that had survived 27 Christmases, 2 deaths, and 1 slow unraveling of her family. The photo inside had faded, but the emotion hadn't. Her fingers traced the curve of Gregory's cheek, the edge of Emma's smile. Her voice barely rose above a breath. I don't mind losing a house, but not like this. The following morning, Savannah came downstairs with a bounce in her step. Lucille was at the stove frying eggs. Good morning, Savannah said. You seem cheerful. Lucille turned with a serene smile. Some days you just feel the wind shifting. Savannah chuckled. Well, I have good news. The paperwork for the house is moving forward. We'll need you to sign some things before the end of the week. Just formalities. I see. Savannah poured herself a glass of orange juice. I'm glad we're on the same page. Lucille set the pan on the counter. Savannah, can I ask you something? Savannah blinked, then nodded. Of course. Lucille wiped her hands on a towel, then leaned against the sink. Do you ever think about what it means to live in someone else's legacy? Savannah frowned. I'm not sure I follow. This house, Lucille said, gesturing. These walls, these floors, they were built with sacrifices, decades of them. You walk through here like it's a rental property, but it's more than that. It's a story." Savannah laughed short, cruel. "With all due respect, Lucille's stories don't pay the bills." Lucille's eyes didn't waver. "But they're what live after us." Savannah tossed her hair. "Spare me the sentiment. You had your time. This is mine now." Lucille's voice softened. "And what will you leave behind?" Savannah stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "You don't get to guilt me. You don't get to judge me. You clung to this house like it made you important, but all it did was keep you stuck." Lucille nodded slowly. "Maybe. But here's what's going to happen," Savannah continued. "You're going to sign the documents when I bring them. You're going to move out, and you're going to stay out." Lucille said nothing. Savannah smirked. "Do I make myself clear?" Lucille looked down at the towel in her hands, then back up at Savannah. "Perfectly." She folded the towel neatly and placed it on the counter. Then she walked away, up the stairs, past the creaking floorboards, into her room. She closed the door, locked it, and exhaled. She didn't cry. Her hands were steady, her eyes sharp as steel. The wind picked up the night before it all began, howling low through the eaves, rattling the shutters like a restless memory. Lucille sat in the darkened living room, wrapped in an old quilt, the only light coming from the fireplace embers and the faint green glow of the microwave clock in the kitchen. It was 11:47 p.m. She should have been in bed, should have been resting, but sleep wasn't something she trusted anymore. Her eyes moved slowly across the room, stopping on the photograph above the mantel, the same one that had anchored her life for decades. Gregory with a missing tooth, Emma laughing mid-breath, Tyson with his rough carpenter's hands resting on her shoulder. Lucille reached up and gently lifted the frame from its hook. It was heavier than it looked. She carried it to the dining room and sat at the table, sliding her fingers beneath the backing until it came free with a soft pop. Inside, tucked between the cardboard and the backing board, were 5 folded documents in archival sleeves, photos of Savannah's transactions, copies of forged IDs, encrypted receipts from a hidden email address, a scanned record of the wire transfer scheduled to hit Thursday morning. Walter had printed everything twice. One copy he kept in a locked briefcase in the back of his Bronco. The other now lived in this frame, hidden behind a smile behind the illusion of a happy family. It was fitting. Savannah had underestimated the wrong woman. Lucille resealed the frame and returned it to the mantel. It looked untouched. And then the sound came, soft, subtle. A single creak from the back porch, a whisper against the door frame. She stood still, holding her breath. Another click, the sound of metal touching metal. Lockpicks. Lucille moved swiftly but silently to the hallway. She didn't flick on the lights. Instead, she opened the hallway closet and reached for the wooden cane she kept near the umbrellas, not for defense, but for appearance. Her heart pounded, but her mind was a clear, flat sheet of glass. She slipped back into the living room and eased onto the couch, pulling the blanket back over her lap. Then she closed her eyes and waited. The door opened at 12:04 a.m. No knock, no hesitation. Just the sound of hinges complaining against the frame. Lucille heard the faint shuffle of rubber soles on the entryway rug. Then 2 voices, low, sharp-edged, one with a clipped European accent, the other younger, faster. "Left side. The hallway first. Closet's too small for gear. Check above the stairwell." They didn't expect her to be awake. She didn't move. She let her breathing slow, her chest rise and fall just enough to look natural. Footsteps moved past her toward the staircase. She heard drawers open, cabinet doors creak, paper rustling, a hissed curse. Nothing. She's moved it. I told you she's not as soft as she looks. Lucille focused on her pulse, focused on keeping it low and visible. They moved toward the dining room. One of them tapped a phone screen, casting a sliver of blue light across the floor. She's got to have a safe. This much heat, she wouldn't leave it unsecured. Look again. Picture frames, behind the drywall, inside the vent system. They were looking for evidence, looking for a recorder, for documents, for proof that Savannah had let her mask slip too far. They wouldn't find it, not tonight. At 12:22 a.m. they gave up. Lucille heard them curse under their breath, retreating the same way they came through the back porch out into the wind. She didn't open her eyes until 10 minutes after the last footstep vanished. She stood slowly, joints stiff from the cold. Then she went to the front door, locked it, latched it, and leaned her forehead against the wood. "You're almost there," she told herself. "Just a little longer." The next morning the house was bright with golden sun bird song weaving through the air like nothing had happened. Lucille made tea. She didn't mention the break-in. Savannah hadn't returned last night, probably shacked up in a hotel room with her hard drives and secrets gloating over how easy it all had been. Lucille texted Walter with a single phrase. They came. "Frames untouched. We're green." He replied within seconds. "Meet at 3, park 2 miles south of the trailhead. Bring nothing electronic. We're go." She sipped her tea slowly, watching steam rise from the rim. The air tasted different that morning. Not like relief, not yet, but like inevitability. Like the final page of a chapter curling beneath your fingers. At 2:15 p.m., Lucille slipped on her cardigan, stepped out the front door, and walked the long gravel path to her truck. She passed the mailbox, the stone bird bath, and the roses she'd planted the summer after Emma's funeral. They were blooming now, bright and defiant. She drove past the lake, past the old schoolhouse, until she reached the rendezvous point Walter had sent. A small dirt clearing nestled beneath sycamores. His Bronco waited there idling in the shade. Walter stood by the hood arms, crossed a folder tucked beneath one elbow. He wore dark jeans, a windbreaker, and mirrored sunglasses that made him look like a man with secrets too heavy for small talk. Lucille stepped out. "Morning," she said. "Afternoon," he corrected. "You sleep?" "Not really." He handed her the folder. "This is your copy. No names, no dates, but enough to trigger interest." Lucille flipped it open. Each page was exact time-stamped screenshots, call logs, transaction receipts, an image of Savannah with Dimitri hands mid-exchange. "Do they believe us?" she asked. Walter nodded. "They're watching her now, but they won't move without the final act." Lucille looked at him. "And that's today," Walter exhaled. "That's today." He reached into the back of his truck and pulled out a wire, the kind that nestled beneath the collar. He held it up. "Still sure about this?" Lucille smiled faintly. "I've never been more sure of anything." She turned, lifted her hair, and let him fasten the device. Walter's voice softened. "Lucille, if she suspects..." "She won't," Lucille cut in. "She thinks I've already surrendered." Walter hesitated. "She underestimates you." "Everyone does," Lucille replied. Then she stepped back into her truck, started the engine, and drove back toward the storm she had invited into her home, ready to end it. By nightfall, everything would be in motion. And by morning nothing would ever be the same again. The front porch gleamed under the late afternoon sun, polished by Lucille's careful hands just hours earlier. She'd swept it that morning like any dutiful homeowner expecting guests. But today her guest wasn't a friend. Today her guest was a trap. At exactly 4:03 p.m., the sleek black BMW curved into the driveway, its tinted windows catching the light like dark water. Savannah stepped out first, radiant in a fitted navy dress, heels clicking against the concrete with her usual precision. Her hair was swept into a loose bun, her lips painted a decisive red. She walked around to the passenger side and opened the door with the practiced grace of someone unveiling a masterpiece. "Mr. Liang," she said, smiling brightly, "welcome to the Harper estate." Walter Briggs emerged in character, immaculately dressed in a tailored gray suit, gold cufflinks, and an understated Rolex. He wore wire-frame glasses and carried a leather folio. A thick Chinese accent colored his English, deliberate and controlled. "Thank you, Ms. Voss," he said, bowing slightly. "Your message was intriguing." Lucille watched from the kitchen window just out of sight. Her heart didn't race. It beat with steady resolve. She could hear Walter's voice through the small receiver taped behind the photograph on the fireplace mantel. Every word, every pause piped through her earbud like a secret unfolding in real time. Savannah ushered Walter through the front door, giving him a practice tour. She spoke like a realtor, every word rehearsed. "This property sits on 2 acres of private land," she said, sweeping her hand toward the bay windows. "No neighbors within 1,000 yards, ideal for discretion." Walter nodded. "Very good. And the legal title?" "In my mother-in-law's name," Savannah said, laughing lightly. "But not for long. She's retiring. We've already drafted the transitional paperwork. It will be clean, just as we discussed." Lucille's jaw tightened. Savannah led him through the house, The study, the sunroom, the newly cleared living room, now devoid of personal touches. Lucille had stripped it bare on purpose. It looked like a home already forgotten. And here, Savannah said, guiding him toward the back of the house, is the garage and storage facility. We've modified it slightly. My team uses it for document handling temporary transfers. Walter tilted his head. You mean storage of specialized assets? Savannah smiled, among other things. Lucille could see them now moving toward the garden path through the back windows. Walter carried his folio, low, his gaze calm. Savannah's stride was effortless. She looked like someone who believed she'd already won. The garden had changed. Savannah had cleared the rows of lavender bushes that once flanked the path. In their place stood neat hedges and a gravel walkway leading to the tool shed, a modest structure but recently reinforced with electronic locks and soundproofing. Walter paused at the threshold. Here, he asked. Savannah nodded. Here. It's discreet, secure, and as of Friday, yours. Walter opened the door. Inside, a folding table held a laptop, a stack of manila folders, and a small printer. 2 metal filing cabinets stood in the corner. A single light bulb swung overhead, flickering slightly. Savannah gestured to the table. The files we discussed, contracts, alternate IDs, proof of viability, everything's here. Once you transfer the funds, I'll hand over the encryption codes. Walter stepped forward and opened the top folder. Inside were 6 forged passports, American, Belgian, Taiwanese. He flipped to the next document. A rental agreement signed in Lucille's forged signature, a notarized deed, a Swiss bank receipt. It was everything they needed. He looked at Savannah. I will need confirmation of the account's liquidity. Of course, she said, lifting the laptop lid. It's all prepped. As she bent over the keyboard, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at it, frowning. Lucille stepped onto the back porch, then just a single footstep deliberate. Savannah didn't hear it, but Walter looked up. Lucille walked slowly down the garden path, hands clasped behind her back, her cardigan swaying slightly in the breeze. She said nothing, didn't rush, just approached like a woman checking the tomatoes. Savannah looked up, then froze. Lucille stepped into the doorway, blocking the light. Savannah's face drained of color. What are you doing here? She hissed. Lucille tilted her head. Just walking my land. This is private. No, Lucille interrupted, her voice calm, almost soft. This is mine. Walter stepped back, slowly signaling. 3 seconds later, the door behind Savannah burst open. FBI hands where we can see them. Savannah's scream was swallowed by the chaos. Agents in dark jackets poured into the shed. Savannah stumbled backward, knocking over the table. Folders flew into the air like startled birds. A passport slid under the cabinet. Her heel caught on the gravel and she fell hard onto the floor, hands raised instinctively. Lucille didn't flinch. Walter removed his glasses, pulling the wire from under his collar. Target secured, he said calmly into the receiver. 2 agents lifted Savannah to her feet, twisting her arms behind her back. Her face twisted not in pain, but in disbelief. Rage. She turned toward Lucille, her voice cracking. You lied to me. Lucille took 1 step closer, her expression unreadable. You lied to everyone. You used me. Savannah spat, eyes wild. You set me up like some criminal. You are, Lucille said quietly. You just never thought anyone would notice. Savannah lunged forward, but the agents held her firm. You tricked me. Lucille leaned in just slightly, her voice low and level. You did that to yourself. Savannah's body trembled as the cuffs clicked into place. I'll ruin you, she hissed. Lucille gave a faint smile. You already tried. As the agents led Savannah down the path, Walter stepped beside Lucille. For a long moment they stood in silence, watching the woman disappear into the waiting SUV sirens, quiet but flashing. Walter finally spoke. You all right? Lucille nodded once. She said I was harmless. Walter chuckled under his breath. She thought wrong. Lucille turned toward the house, her garden, her life. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just exhaled long and steady like someone waking from a long, relentless storm. And then quietly she went inside. The story hit the news before the sun did. By dawn, the headline was everywhere, from local bulletins to national outlets, morning talk shows to legal blogs. It was the kind of tale producers fought over. 71-year-old California woman unmasks international fraud ring from her living room. Some called her a whistleblower, others called her a hero. A few dubbed her the grandmother with teeth. Lucille Harper didn't watch the coverage. She sat on the porch with a cup of black coffee and the old quilt wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the ridge where fog settled like memory. She didn't feel like a hero. She didn't feel triumphant. She just felt hollow. She hadn't heard from Gregory in 2 days. Then just after 10 that morning, a black SUV pulled into the driveway. She didn't need to see his face to know. She rose slowly, folding the quilt over the railing as the passenger door swung open, and Gregory stepped out, duffel bag slung over his shoulder, face drawn, eyes burning. He stood in the gravel staring at her. She said nothing. "Is it true?" he demanded. Lucille didn't blink. "You flew all the way back just to ask that." He stormed up the porch steps. "You set up my wife. You called the police. You orchestrated a federal sting in our house, Mom. What the hell were you thinking?" Lucille nodded once. "Come inside." "I'm not sitting down for tea," he shouted. "I'm not offering tea," she said quietly. "I'm offering the truth." That silenced him. He followed her into the living room, the same room where he had opened Christmas presents as a boy, where he had danced with Emma at their engagement party, where he had kissed Savannah on the forehead after showing her the ultrasound photo. Now the room was quiet, sober. Lucille motioned to the coffee table. There, neatly stacked, was a tan folder, and beside it an envelope. She pushed them toward him. Gregory hesitated, then dropped into the armchair and opened the folder. The first page made him pause. The second turned his face white. Passports, offshore bank records, forged tax documents, surveillance photos. He flipped faster. The time-stamped image of Savannah handing over documents in the shed. The forged signature in his mother's name. A wire transfer request in Dutch. A signed prenup waiver Savannah had tried to hide. Gregory's fingers trembled. No, she wouldn't. Lucille said nothing. His hands moved slower now, as if they weighed more. He stopped on the still of Savannah with the man from Cafe Verona leaning into him, lips nearly brushing his cheek. His face cracked open. "She said she was helping," he whispered. "She said she was building something for us, that the money was for the baby." Lucille reached for the envelope, handed it to him. He opened it. Inside was a single letter, handwritten, cream-colored stationery. "My dearest Gregory, there's a reason I never sent this, because I didn't want to be the person who ruined your world. I knew what I saw in Savannah. I knew what she was. But you needed to see it too. To believe it, not because I told you, but because truth, real truth, is something that has to break your heart before it can set you free." Gregory's mouth trembled. He stopped reading halfway through. "She manipulated me," he said softly. "She isolated you. She used Dawson." "She used you," Lucille interrupted gently. "We were just the collateral." He dropped the letter and covered his face with both hands. "I let her push you out. I told myself it was temporary, that once she settled in, things would fix themselves." Lucille sat across from him. "There's something you need to know, Greg. She never planned to fix anything. She planned to disappear with your son and everything she could strip from this house." Gregory lowered his hands. "I should have listened. I should have asked more questions. I should have—" "You were in love," Lucille said. "And love blinds even the brightest minds." His shoulders shook. He looked like a man watching the scaffolding of his life collapse one beam at a time. Like the version of himself he'd built, husband, father, provider, had been gutted, exposed for the fiction it was. And then a small sound. A breath. A soft gurgle. Lucille turned her head. In the doorway stood an agent, one of the child protection officers assigned to Dawson during the temporary custody review. She held the boy in her arms, bundled in a soft yellow blanket, thumb in mouth, blinking sleepily. "I thought it might be better," the agent said, "if someone familiar brought him back." Gregory stood slowly. Lucille watched as he walked to the woman, arms outstretched like a drowning man reaching for shore. He took Dawson into his arms and held him tight against his chest. The child wriggled briefly, then stilled. For a long moment no one spoke. Gregory turned to his mother. Tears streamed down his cheeks. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said, voice cracking. "I am so sorry." Lucille stepped forward. She didn't say anything. She just wrapped her arms around both of them, her son, her grandson, and held on. Not because it fixed anything, but because it was the only thing left to do. The only thing that ever really mattered. Lucille Harper stood in the living room of the Harper estate one last time. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows, casting long golden rays across the hardwood floor that once echoed with Gregory's running feet. Emma's quiet laughter, the creak of rocking chairs, and the warm hum of old jazz on Sunday mornings. But now the house felt hollow, like a beautiful piano with every string cut. Gregory stood beside her, Dawson asleep in his arms. "You're sure about this?" he asked. Lucille nodded slowly, her voice calm, final. "I won't live in a place built on ghosts and shadows. That house was a home once. It's just a shell now." Gregory didn't argue. He looked around the room at the fireplace mantel still bearing the oak-framed photo, at the worn rug beneath the coffee table, the spot where he'd taken his first steps. He swallowed. "I thought we'd bury you in this house." Lucille smiled not unkindly. "Then I guess you're going to have to bury me somewhere else." She handed him a key, the last copy. "Take what you want," she said. "The rest will go to auction." 3 weeks later, the Harper estate was sold to a preservation society. A quiet couple from Oregon planned to restore it and open a historical book inn. Lucille smiled at that. At least the walls would get to hold stories again. But she didn't take a dime from the final sale. Instead, she stood outside the office of a local nonprofit and handed the first check over herself, made out for a 6-figure sum and marked for one specific purpose. The Second Chapter Fund, for foster children entering college with no family to support them. The woman behind the desk blinked, stunned. "Mrs. Harper, this is incredibly generous." Lucille simply nodded. No child should carry the weight of being forgotten. After the paperwork, after the signatures, after the final glance at the house she'd once thought she would die in, Lucille drove north up winding country roads past citrus groves and redwood canopies until the landscape changed and the lake revealed itself like an old friend. Lake Oriole. The water was still, silver in the late morning light. She parked the truck in front of a weathered log cabin smaller than she remembered, nestled among pine and wild rosemary. Its roof slanted slightly like it had been shrugging off years of snow. Walter was already there, sitting on the porch steps, a cup of black coffee steaming in his hand. "Place hasn't changed much," he said. Lucille stepped out of the truck and let the wind wash over her. "It never does," she replied. The cabin had belonged to Walter's brother once. They'd all come here in the summers, Tyson, Emma, Gregory, even the family dog Max. It had no Wi-Fi, no TV, and only one working bathroom. But it had silence, space, and the kind of time that moved like honey. They spent the first week repairing the floorboards and repainting the shutters. Walter replaced the old stove, while Lucille hung string lights along the eaves. Every night they grilled fish on the back deck and watched the sun bleed into the water. But it was during their 3rd week that Lucille pulled the folded flyer from her coat pocket. A for-lease notice in the window of a tiny lakeside storefront. Walter raised an eyebrow. Thinking of opening a souvenir shop. She handed it to him. "A bookstore." Walter blinked. "A bookstore, Lucille, do people even read anymore?" "They will," she said simply, "if someone gives them something worth reading." By mid-autumn, the shop had a name. Carved into hand-sanded driftwood and nailed above the door in soft blue script, Second Chapter. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and paper. The shelves held second-hand novels, handwritten letters, out-of-print poetry collections. There was a corner for children with a plush armchair shaped like a bear. And on the back wall hung a corkboard titled Unwritten Pages, where visitors could leave anonymous notes, stories, confessions, or prayers. Lucille worked the morning shift. Walter handled repairs and brought coffee. On Saturdays, a retired English teacher came in to read aloud to the local kids. On Sundays, the front table was cleared for a chess club. The store never made much money, but that wasn't the point. Every soul who walked in left a little fuller than when they came. Gregory brought Dawson every other weekend. They stayed in the cabin now with a nursery built into the back. Dawson, now toddling, learned to climb the porch steps on his own. He learned to throw pebbles into the lake and say grandma with his fists curled in excitement. One day Gregory walked into the shop holding his son on one hip and said quietly, "He deserves to know peace." Lucille smiled. "So did you." He looked around the store. "This place feels like a beginning." "It is," she said. "That's what second chapters are for." And though neither of them said it, both understood the truth. The first chapter had nearly broken them. But this one was written in healing, and it was only just beginning. The bell above the bookstore door jingled softly, just like it always did, no louder than a whisper, no more urgent than a breath. That's how Lucille Harper liked it. Nothing too sudden, nothing that startled. Second chapter had become a heartbeat in the lakeside town. A quiet, steady pulse drawing people in, not for shopping, but for stillness, for connection, for stories. Lucille stood behind the counter, gently unpacking a box of donated books wrapped in old newspaper. A customer nearby ran their fingers over the spine of a worn Hemingway. A teenager in the corner flipped through a comic, cheeks flushed in concentration. In the children's nook, a little girl curled into the bear-shaped armchair with a fairy tale balanced on her knees and her legs swinging over the edge. The light in the shop was different here. It filtered through the front windows like honey, gentle, healing. Every Thursday morning, a group of retirees came to read aloud chapters from their favorite novels. On Fridays, the Blue Pen Writers Club left folded pages in the unwritten pages board, anonymous snippets of heartbreak memory poetry. And every first Sunday of the month, Lucille hosted Story Circle, where anyone could sit in the center chair no matter their age and share a story from their life, true or not. And they came. Boy, did they come. Teachers, war veterans, single moms, a widower who hadn't spoken aloud in months, a quiet teenage girl who finally stood and said, "My name is not what my father calls me." Lucille never interrupted. She only listened. Then she'd clap twice and say, "Next story." People told her the bookstore had changed the town. She told them it had simply reminded the town it had a heart. One morning she found a small envelope tucked between the slats of the front door. No return address, no stamp, just her name, Mrs. Harper. She opened it slowly. The handwriting was jagged, childlike. "Dear Mrs. Harper, I live at the group home on Ridge Road. We came to your store last week with Ms. Diane. You gave me a free book about dragons. I read it 3 times. I liked the part where the girl wasn't scared anymore. I want to be like that. I want to be like you. Love, Marley, at 9. Lucille pressed the letter to her chest and closed her eyes. That same afternoon, she made a wooden plaque and hung it above the Story Circle chair. It read, "Be brave, be kind, be someone's second chapter." 2 weeks later, she stood at the front of Maple Hollow Elementary School behind a microphone, staring at rows of wiggling students, teachers lining the back of the room, parents on folding chairs. She had been invited to speak as part of the school's Voices of Our Town Week. The principal had called her a hometown hero. Lucille chuckled softly at the thought. She cleared her throat. "You know," she said, "when I was your age, I thought only people in movies had adventures. That only the young or the loud or the lucky got to be brave." The students watched, eyes wide, mouths full of wonder and string cheese. "But I've learned," she continued, "that courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it walks into a bookstore and says, 'Do you have something that understands me?'" She told them the story of a quiet woman, a mother, a grandmother, someone who once felt invisible, until she chose not to be. The applause at the end was honest, messy, full of kids clapping too early or too loud. And in the back, behind the folding chairs, Walter stood with his arms crossed, nodding like a man who'd just seen a sunrise no one else noticed. Afterward, as they walked to the truck, Walter said, "That wasn't half bad." Lucille raised an eyebrow. "That was a full applause, Briggs." He grinned. "Fine, you're a regular Maya Angelou." She elbowed him lightly. "And you're late for inventory." That night, after the bookstore closed, they sat on the back porch of the cabin with the lake shimmering in silence. Fireflies drifted between the pines, and Dawson, now almost 2, ran barefoot in the grass, while Gregory packed up toys from the yard. Gregory stepped onto the porch and cleared his throat. "I have something for you," he said. Lucille looked up. He handed her a small envelope. Inside was a photo. 3 people framed in golden hour sunlight. Gregory kneeling beside Dawson, both of them smiling wide, and Lucille behind them, hands resting on their shoulders, eyes gentle light in her smile. On the bottom of the photo in Gregory's handwriting were the words, "Second chapter, 3 generations, 1 beginning." Lucille stared at it for a long time. "I didn't know you were taking pictures." Gregory shrugged. "You were too busy being the center of the story." Walter leaned over. "Frame that one." Lucille nodded slowly, her eyes shining but no tears falling. She rose, walked inside, and set the photo gently on the front counter of the bookstore right beneath the unwritten pages board. Then she turned the open sign to closed, flipped off the lights, and whispered to the shelves, "See you tomorrow. We've still got stories left to tell." Lucille Harper stood barefoot on the pinewood floor of the cabin's front room, holding the old oak picture frame in her hands like it was a living thing. The frame had aged. There were hairline cracks in the wood, the varnish worn thin along the corners, where fingers had once lingered in prayer and memory and grief. It had seen decades. It had held the same photograph for over 20 years. Gregory's gap-toothed grin, Emma's wind-blown hair, Lucille's younger smile full of hope and worry, and the unspoken heaviness of motherhood. But today that picture was gone. Folded, preserved, placed gently into the back pages of a leather-bound family album that now rested on the shelf in the bookstore where others could find it, if they ever needed proof of where this family began. In its place, Lucille slid in a new photo, one taken just weeks ago. Gregory kneeling in the tall grass by the lakeside, Dawson laughing in his arms, and Lucille standing behind them with both hands resting on their shoulders. Her eyes not turned to the camera, but toward the boy, her grandson, her second chance. She pressed the frame closed and heard the familiar soft click. It sounded like closure, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something sacred. The window beside her was open, and the late afternoon light spilled in like honey, thick and golden. The wind shifted the curtains. Outside, children's voices drifted from the bookstore where Walter was hosting Story Circle without her today. She could hear their laughter, bright, unburdened, the kind that rises without shame or memory. She hung the photo on the wall just to the left of the window, not above the fireplace, not over a mantel like a shrine, but next to light, next to sky. It belonged there, not in the past, but in the day-to-day, where the sun could reach it. For a long time she just stood there. She had no need to cry anymore. She'd done enough of that in silence. What filled her now was something quieter. Not joy, exactly. Something deeper. Peace. She moved to her desk, opened the drawer, and pulled out her stationery, the thick, cream-colored kind she reserved for letters she never sent. The ones that stayed folded in the drawer, tucked beneath receipts and newspaper clippings, and a pressed rose from Emma's wedding bouquet. She uncapped her pen. And then, for the first time since everything had unraveled and reknitted itself into something new, she began to write. "Dear Gregory, I've written you many letters over the years, some in anger, some in sorrow. None of them mailed. This one is different. You were my only child, the only proof I ever had that love could survive the world's attempts to break it. I raised you in a house that we built from scratch with the kind of love that didn't wear diamonds or travel first class, but kept the lights on when hope was dim. When you left me behind for her, I told myself it was just time claiming its due. That children outgrow mothers, the way trees outgrow the soil they were planted in. But the truth is, I never stopped needing you. And then you needed me. And you didn't know it. Savannah didn't just steal papers and money. She stole trust. She made me a stranger in your life. But I've stopped mourning what we lost, because I see you now, in Dawson's laugh, in your tired, grateful eyes, in the way you touch my shoulder as if saying I remember who you are now. So here is what I've never said out loud: I forgive you for all of it, and I love you always. Mom." She signed the letter, folded it carefully, and slipped it into a plain envelope. She didn't seal it. She placed it on the windowsill beneath the newly hung photo where the breeze could lift it if it wanted to. Then Lucille stepped out onto the front porch. The sky was turning the color of ash and peach, one of those skies that only happened when the wind was warm and the lake still. She sat on the swing, the wood groaning in a familiar rhythm beneath her. Across the field she could see Dawson dancing in the grass, chasing the last firefly of the evening. Gregory stood behind him, arms crossed, watching the boy with the look of a man who knew exactly how close he'd come to losing everything. Walter was locking the front door of the bookstore, waving at a teenage girl who had stayed after Story Circle to ask about part-time work. The bookstore light flicked off. Then the porch light flicked on. The laughter of children floated up the hill, mixing with the whisper of wind and the rustling of trees. Lucille rocked slowly, her gaze turned to the lake. No more battles to fight, no more secrets to keep. Just this moment, just this place. She closed her eyes and smiled, because sometimes the most powerful pictures don't preserve the past. They open a window to the future and hang there quietly, letting in the light.